The queen said, "Choose one of my daughters, human." 3 princesses stood before me. The perfect heir, the military genius, and the one they called defective. Everyone expected me to pick beauty or power. I chose the outcast. The court gasped. But what I saw in her irregular bioluminescence would change interstellar diplomacy forever. Light fractured through the crystalline walls of the throne room, scattering prismatic patterns across the floor that shifted with every breath. Ambassador Thomas Reed stood firmly on his own 2 feet, but the moving light made the ground feel less certain. The air hummed with the near-silent whir of recording drones, each one a glassy eye trained on him, broadcasting his every blink to a watching galaxy. This wasn't the usual diplomatic greeting. No exchange of gifts, no preliminary negotiations over trade routes or border disputes. Queen Vixendra had dispensed with all that. Her command hung in the air between them, thin and sharp as shaved crystal. "Choose one of my daughters. Now." Thomas could feel the collective breath of Earth's government somewhere behind his ribs, a tightness where his own lungs should be. He'd read the briefings. He knew the stats on televised diplomacy, the way a camera's lens could magnify a swallow, a twitch, a moment of doubt into a system-wide incident. Negotiations in private allowed for backtracking, for quiet concessions. This was a performance. His eyes swept the chamber. 3 princesses stood slightly behind their mother, each a distinct silhouette against the shimmering walls. Court officials flanked the throne in their formal robes, faces a careful study in neutrality. He recognized the set of Chancellor Thexmer's shoulders, the slight tilt of a military attaché's head. Their stillness was its own kind of shouting. Each daughter was a path forward, a different future for humanity, packaged in living light and political consequence. Pick the heir and you got stability, an alliance that looked strong on the feeds. Pick the warrior and you got a fleet at your back for a price. The 3rd daughter lingered a half step behind her sisters, her own light different, uneven. The silence stretched. In a room designed to amplify sound, the lack of it was deafening. Thomas could hear the rustle of his own formal jacket, the faint click of a drone adjusting its focus. He was a man standing at a fork in the road, and every signpost was written in a language he was still learning. This wasn't just about securing an ally. It was about choosing the story humanity would tell for the next 100 years. His training had covered protocol, language, cultural taboos. It hadn't covered this: how to weigh the fate of worlds against the subtle, almost imperceptible flicker in a princess's bioluminescent markings. The advice from his handlers had been clear, a list of strategic advantages and political calculations. But in this bright, silent room, all that data felt like dust. He was alone with it. The weight of the moment, the eyes of 2 civilizations, the knowledge that a single word from him would lock in a destiny. His career was the least of it. This choice would ripple out, touching lives on mining colonies and bustling starbases, in cityscapes on Earth and the floating gardens of Luminar. He took a slow breath, the air tasting of ozone and something floral, and prepared to speak. Then the 1st daughter stepped forward, Zarelyn. Her bioluminescence bloomed across her skin in perfect symmetry, geometric patterns that flowed without a single jagged edge. She held herself with the stillness of someone who'd been practicing posture since she could stand. She was the heir, the safe bet, the one who represented the Luminary Empire exactly as it presented itself to the galaxy. Ordered, beautiful, and utterly predictable. But Thomas had read the files. That beauty was a political instrument, polished and honed. It could be a shield, deflecting difficult questions, or a distraction, drawing the eye away from less pleasant realities. Choosing her meant aligning with centuries of tradition. It meant a stable, if somewhat stagnant, alliance. It also meant accepting that the polished surface might hide currents of ambition that ran very, very deep. Her smile was flawless, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, which were busy calculating the angles of the room. Next came Villana. Her movement was all sharp efficiency, no wasted motion. The light patterns on her skin weren't elegant spirals, but stark, angular shapes that looked less like art and more like rank insignia on a battlefield map. She was the military mind, the strategic asset. Her dossier was thick with analyses of her tactical innovations, her renowned victories in war games, her influence over the fleet commanders. Choosing her was a different kind of gamble. It promised immediate muscle, a powerful ally in any conflict. It also promised that conflict would likely find you. Her version of peace looked a lot like a permanent state of high alert, a galaxy permanently braced for the next fight. Thomas could practically hear the defense contractors back on Earth already adjusting their projections upward. She offered not just an alliance but an entire war economy, ready to kick into a higher gear. And then there was the third daughter, Kurzith. She didn't step forward so much as she was simply present, lingering a half-pace behind her sisters as if by habit. Her bioluminescent patterns were a mess. Where her sisters displayed clean, intentional designs, hers were a chaotic splash of light, asymmetrical and fragmented. The court's dismissive whispers were a soft, constant hum in the background. Genetic defect. Anomaly. A flawed branch. Thomas's eyes, however, didn't slide away in discomfort. They stayed. Where others saw broken lines, he saw unexpected complexity. The patterns weren't random. They had a strange, almost fractal depth to them. Layers upon layers that the perfect, flat surfaces of her sisters lacked. It was the difference between a simple printed flag and a hand-woven tapestry seen up close. He ran through the dossiers in his mind. Zeralin's file had been a book. Falana's, a manual. Kurzith's was a pamphlet. 3 pages mostly, with entire sections blacked out. The analyst's conclusions were a masterclass in vague dismissal, limited political utility, non-standard presentation, of negligible strategic value. They didn't just lack information, they actively discouraged curiosity. That more than anything made him look closer. Each princess was a door. Zeralin's door led to a well-appointed room where everything was in its place, and you might never know what was locked in the drawers. Falana's door opened onto a parade ground, all gleaming metal and the smell of engine fuel, stretching toward a horizon dotted with conflict. Kurzith's door was different. It was unmarked, made of an unfamiliar wood, and no one had given him the key. It was the only one that promised the one thing a good diplomat should always be ready for: a genuine surprise. The chamber wasn't just a room, it was a stage, and everyone knew their lines except him. Luminary protocol for royal presentations filled 3 data slates back in Thomas's quarters. He'd spent weeks memorizing the precise cadence for compliments, the exact angle for a bow, the formal phrases of admiration for a princess's luminous display. The script was clear. You praised Zeralin's perfection. You acknowledged Valana's strength. The script had no lines for Kurzith. Her presence was a paragraph someone had tried to delete, but the formatting was still messed up. Every expectation in that crystalline space pressed on him like a physical weight. The architecture itself favored symmetry, the refracted light creating orderly, repeating patterns on the floor. Choosing the irregular princess would be like dropping a dissonant note into a perfectly tuned symphony. It wouldn't just be unexpected, it would be an insult to their entire sense of order. It would break protocols concerning royal dignity, aesthetic appreciation, and diplomatic courtesy. He could already picture the formal complaints piling up on some clerk's desk. He watched the audience. Chancellor Thexmer, standing to the Queen's right, offered a nearly imperceptible nod toward Zeralin. It was a tiny motion, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, but it was there, a suggestion, an approval. The courtiers around him mirrored this subtle endorsement with their own still postures. They were a wall of silent agreement. Across the way, the cluster of military attachés presented a different picture. They didn't nod. They didn't need to. Their lean was toward Valana, a collective shift in center of gravity so slight it was almost a thermal reading, not a visible movement. Their eyes held the flat, assessing look of officers already planning deployment schedules and resource allocation. Choosing the warrior princess meant promotions, new commands, a bigger slice of the budget. Their interest was practically a physical thing in the air, sharp and metallic. This was the luminary ideal made flesh. Zeralin and Valana were 2 sides of the same polished coin. One represented the perfect, unchanging society, a work of art finished centuries ago. The other represented the power required to keep it that way, clean and defended. Their light patterns were the embodiment of that philosophy, controlled, intentional, and above all legible. You could look at them and know exactly what you were getting. Kurzith's light was illegible. It was a challenge to the whole system. It suggested that perfection might be boring, that symmetry might be sterile. In a society that used bioluminescence as a direct reflection of bloodline, status, and virtue, her irregular patterns were more than a defect. They were a philosophical problem, an unanswered question the court had apparently decided to just ignore. Thomas noticed how the courtiers' gazes slid over her. They would look at Zerilyn, then Villana, their eyes tracing the approved patterns with something like relief. But when their sight line passed over Kurzeth, they glanced away. They focused on a wall sconce, the floor of their own hands. It was a collective act of dismissal, practiced and smooth. No one wanted to acknowledge the flaw in the presentation. Her positioning felt staged. She wasn't just standing behind her sisters. She was set apart, placed in a slightly dimmer pool of light as if by a director's careful instruction. The whole ceremony seemed designed to highlight her difference, to make her the obvious wrong answer before a word was even spoken. It was too neat, too convenient. It had the feel of a play where one character exists only to make the others look better. Thomas felt a slow, cold curiosity begin to push back against the weight of all that expectation. Why go to such lengths to make one of your own daughters look bad? His gaze kept drifting back to Kurzeth. It was like trying to ignore a glitch in a clean piece of code. Where the court saw a flaw in her bioluminescent display, a mistake in the genetic drafting, Thomas's mind tried to parse the logic of it. The patterns weren't random smears of light. They had a structure, but it was dense, layered. It reminded him of something. A half-remembered image from a cultural database, a footnote from a history of luminary aesthetics. It was the kind of art they made before they decided on one approved style. That was it. Her markings echoed the asymmetrical designs from centuries back, before the Empire standardized everything from education to genetics. That art valued complexity over simplicity, hidden meaning over obvious beauty. It was supposed to represent a more nuanced, less controlled way of thinking. Her light wasn't broken. It was just written in an older language that everyone else had forgotten how to read. He watched her posture. She wasn't trying to hide her difference the way you might slouch to seem smaller. She didn't project defiance either. No angry challenge in her stance. She was just still. Her focus wasn't on the cameras or her mother or even him. Not directly. Her attention was on the room. On the people in it. While Zerilyn and Villana held their positions for the audience performing their roles, Kurzeth was doing reconnaissance. She was studying the watchers, then he saw it. A subtle shift in the light across her forearm. It wasn't a flicker or a malfunction. It was a change. The pattern reconfigured itself, the lines shifting almost imperceptibly like a dial adjusting. It happened again a moment later, a different part of her display altering its configuration. It responded to the room. To the hum of the drones, maybe, or to the shifting postures of the courtiers. This wasn't a static biological feature like a birthmark. This was active. It was a display that was also an interface, taking in information and adjusting its output accordingly. The realization was a quiet click in his mind. This wasn't a defect. This was a different kind of technology, a more sophisticated one. The story they were selling, the convenient narrative of the imperfect princess, felt flimsy suddenly. It was too clean, too useful for the people who benefited from the current order. A flawless air and a sharp military mind were easy to understand, easy to slot into existing power structures. They were predictable. This, whatever Kurzeth represented, was not. It was easier to call it broken and hope no one looked too closely. Thomas was looking. And the more he looked, the less it looked like a mistake and the more it looked like a carefully hidden asset. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make the most interesting thing in the room appear to be the least valuable. That was a political move he recognized. It was the kind of thing you did when you were afraid of what someone might really be able to do. A fragment of memory surfaced through the pressure of the moment. A piece of academic trivia Thomas had read years ago and promptly filed away. The Keepers. It sounded like a myth, the kind of story a culture tells about itself before it gets serious and bureaucratic. They were supposed to be the original guardians of luminary biotech, the engineers who built the systems that ran their world. Their histories described them less as rulers and more as technicians, the people who kept the lights on and the atmosphere breathable. They were the interface between the people and the planet's own machinery. The texts described their bioluminescent patterns as unreadable to the untrained eye, not flawed, not broken, encrypted. Their light was their access key, a living security protocol. The myths got grander from there, saying a true keeper could talk to planetary defense grids, activate emergency shelter systems, command resource distribution networks during a famine. Their bodies were the login screen for the entire civilization's infrastructure. It was the kind of power that made emperors nervous. Then the official histories just stopped mentioning them. They were politely edited out. An inconvenient chapter in the Empire's otherwise straightforward story of progress and control. The current power structure, the one with chancellors and generals and a queen on a crystal throne, had clearly found it more profitable to let that knowledge fade. It's easier to manage a population when you control the utilities, the defenses, the food supply. A bunch of altruistic technocrats with a biological override for your entire system would be a serious problem for that business model. Their disappearance was less an extinction and more a corporate takeover. Thomas looked at Kurzith, really looked at her, and mentally compared her chaotic light show to the handful of fragmentary images in Earth's xenocultural archives. The archives held scraps of pre-standardization luminary art, salvaged from ruins or preserved by collectors. The patterns matched. Not perfectly, but close enough. The same deliberate asymmetry, the same sense of layered information. It was like finding a key you didn't know you had for a lock everyone told you was welded shut. Her so-called defect wasn't a mistake. It was a birthright. The oldest one in the room, the royal bloodline everyone acknowledged, started with Queen Vexendra's recent ancestors. But this was something else. This was the original operating system showing through a glossy, simplified user interface. Choosing her wouldn't be a rejection of the luminary ideal. It would be a choice to dig past the branding and get to the original hardware. It was the difference between admiring a company's slick promotional brochure and finding the faded hand-drawn blueprints for the machine itself. One was designed to sell you something. The other showed you how it actually worked. The silence in the throne room was no longer just pressure. It was potential. He was standing in front of a door that had been painted over to look like a wall, and he was the only one who could see the faint outline of the handle. The air in the throne room changed. The pressure from the Queen's silent waiting grew from a diplomatic tension to something more immediate, like the dropping barometric pressure before a storm. The whisper of the drones felt louder. Thomas had seconds left. The Queen's fingers, resting on the arm of her throne, tensed the barest amount. The moment for pleasant hesitation was over. He could choose the safe path. Zeri Lin. A traditional alliance, a predictable partner. It would mean signing on to the luminary status quo, a system that clearly worked very well for the people currently in charge. The briefing spoke of stability, of mutual economic benefit, but it was the stability of a finished building where all the rooms were already furnished and locked. There would be no renovations, no surprises. His career would be secure. Earth would have a powerful friend, and nothing would really change for anyone who wasn't already doing well, or he could choose the sharp path. Valana. Choosing her would be like handing the keys to the military. The weapons manufacturers back home would receive the contracts they'd been lobbying for. The security councils would get the starbase access they craved. It was a future of strong borders, military parades, and a constant low-level hum of conflict somewhere on the frontier, a profitable hum. Diplomacy in that future would just be the break between wars. He'd seen what that looked like on the edges of settled space. Refugee camps that sprung up like weeds after a battle, only to be trampled again when the next one began. Every peace treaty he'd helped draft in those sectors had a lifespan measured in months before the generals found a reason to restart the engines. Kurzith was the path off the map. She didn't represent an adjustment to the existing systems. She represented a different operating system entirely. Choosing her was a rejection of the neat, profitable equations of power that had governed this part of the galaxy for generations. It was a bet on something he couldn't fully see yet, a risk that the strange layered patterns on her skin meant what he thought they did. He finally met her eyes directly. He expected to see something there, a plea, a hope, a warning. There was none of that. Her gaze was flat, analytical. She was assessing him the same way he'd been assessing the room. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She was waiting to see if he was worth choosing. If he could see past the story they'd wrapped her in. Her silence wasn't submission. It was a test. He saw the faces from the border systems in his mind, the ones who always got shuffled aside when the big powers made their deals, the ones for whom strategic stability meant a lifetime in a prefab shelter. The existing game was rigged. The board was set. Choosing either of the first two princesses just meant picking a side on that board. Kurzith felt like flipping the table. It was the most reckless, dangerous, undiplomatic thought he'd ever had. The Queen's lips parted, ready to demand his answer. The air was so thin he could hear his own heartbeat. He made the call. The words were out before his brain could run a proper risk assessment. They just left his mouth simple and flat. "I choose Princess Kurzith." The crystal of the chamber caught the sentence and threw it around, the echo making it sound both louder and more fragile than he intended. Kurzith bounced off the walls and back at him. What followed was not a sound but the total absence of one, the kind of quiet that feels dense enough to walk on. The recording drones, which had been humming with a low, busy energy, seemed to pause their internal mechanisms. The silence had its own texture, thick and cold. It was the sound of 1,000 expectations hitting a wall they didn't know was there. Then the room broke. The silence shattered into a dozen smaller, sharper sounds, a sharp intake of breath from the courtiers, a whispered "impossible" from someone near the back, the rustle of formal robes as people shifted their weight, turning to look at each other, their careful neutrality dissolving into open confusion. The chamber fizzed with the energy of a disrupted ritual. Chancellor Thexmer's face was a study in controlled collapse. For a fraction of a second, his perfect diplomatic mask didn't just crack, it fell off completely. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack. It was a raw flash of something between disbelief and a kind of horrified anger. Then he got hold of himself, pulling the mask back into place, but the glimpse had been enough. Thomas had seen the man behind the policy, and he didn't like the choice one bit. The military attachés were less dramatic but just as clear. They didn't gasp. They didn't whisper. They just looked at each other. A series of quick, hard glances passed between them, a silent conversation happening in the space of a blink. Their carefully maintained neutrality became a screen for a rapid, alarmed assessment. Their plans, their projected budgets, their strategic alliances, all of it just got a lot more complicated. Over with the princesses, the reactions were more nuanced. Zerlin's perfectly symmetrical light patterns, which had been glowing with a steady, practiced intensity, flickered. Just for a moment, the light dimmed and then came back, as if a circuit had been briefly interrupted. It wasn't distress. If anything, it looked like the opposite. A release of tension. She hadn't wanted this. The responsibility of being the chosen one, the center of this political storm, was a weight she was happy to let go of. Valana's reaction was purely tactical. Her head tilted a precise number of degrees. Her sharp, angular patterns didn't change, but her focus did. She was no longer looking at Thomas as a diplomatic obstacle. She was looking at him as a variable in a new equation. Her gaze was a recalculation, scanning him for new data, trying to fit this unexpected move into her existing map of power dynamics. He had become interesting. Kurzith herself showed nothing so obvious as surprise. Her expression didn't change, but the chaotic patterns of light across her skin did. They intensified. The light didn't get brighter so much as it got deeper, the layers of complex information becoming more defined, more active. It was the visual equivalent of a system booting up after a long standby mode. There was no smile, no nod of acknowledgement, just an activation. And in that moment, Thomas understood. The Queen's demand, the public spectacle, the pressure, it hadn't just been a test of his diplomatic skill. It was a test of his sight. Could he see past the story they were telling him? Could he recognize the real tool in a room full of decorative instruments? The relief on Zerlin's face, the calculation in Valana's eyes, the sheer panic in Thexmer's. They were all answers to a question he hadn't known he was being asked. He hadn't just made a choice. He'd given the correct answer. The crystal quiet broke open. Chancellor Thexmer was the first to puncture it, his voice a precise, cold instrument. "An unconventional choice," he began, the words smooth as polished glass. One might even call it typically human. A fascination with the broken specimen, the flawed data point, an emotional decision, not a strategic one. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The criticism was engineered for maximum damage, each word chosen to undermine Thomas's credibility, not just as a diplomat, but as a rational being. It framed the choice as a childish lapse, a species-wide character flaw. His words acted like a signal. The courtiers, who had been frozen in shock, now found their voices. A wave of murmured agreement and concern washed through the chamber. "The protocols," one official whispered loudly to another. "The alliance implication," countered a different voice, thick with feigned worry. They weren't just talking to each other. They were performing for the drones, crafting the official narrative of this moment in real time. Their objections were a coordinated effort to box Thomas's decision into a category labeled regrettable mistake. The television broadcast was eating it up. You could almost see the producers in some control room scrambling, thrilled by the unexpected drama but utterly baffled by its source. They'd expected tension between the obvious frontrunners, a diplomatic showdown between tradition and military might. No one had a camera script for this. The drone swiveled, capturing every disapproving frown, every shaken head, every whispered conference. They were building the story of the human ambassador's disastrous error. Through it all, Queen Vexendra was a statue. Her composure was absolute. She showed no reaction to Thomas's choice, to Thexmer's insult, to the building chaos in her court. Her hands remained still on the throne. Her expression was neutral, revealing exactly nothing. It was impossible to tell if she was furious, pleased, or simply bored. She was observing her own ceremony like a scientist watching an experiment unfold. Her daughters mirrored her discipline. Zerilyn and Valana had returned to their places of perfect, unreadable neutrality. Their bioluminescent patterns were back to their controlled, steady glow. They gave no sign of being affected by the commotion around them. It was a display of royal training so complete it felt almost unnatural. They were islands of calm in a suddenly stormy sea. The security details were less static. Their movements were subtle, a professional shuffle of boots on the crystalline floor. They didn't draw weapons or form a wall, but they did reposition themselves. They closed the physical space around the queen and her daughters by a few incremental feet, their posture shifting from ceremonial to protective. The potential for instability, even in a diplomatic setting, had just been recalibrated upward. Thomas stood his ground, taking it all in. The anger from Thexmer's faction was expected. The nervous chatter from the general courtiers was predictable, but his eyes kept tracking to the edges of the room, to certain clusters of officials who wore simpler robes, less ornate jewelry. They weren't joining the chorus of disapproval. They watched the proceedings with a quiet, intense focus, but their mouths stayed shut. They exchanged looks with each other, small nods that were nearly invisible. Their silence was more telling than any protest. They had agendas that didn't involve supporting the chancellor or the military. This disruption, this wild card thrown into the middle of their political game, might just be exactly what they needed. They weren't upset. They were recalculating. The door to Kurzeth's chambers didn't slide open with a hydraulic hiss. It retracted like a living thing, folding back in segments that reminded Thomas of an insect's wing. The room beyond was nothing like the public crystal halls. The air smelled different, less like ozone and flowers, more like damp earth and something metallic, like a storm just passed over a field of old machinery. The walls weren't smooth crystal. They were covered in a living tapestry of bioluminescent patterns, but these weren't for show. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, lines of data flowing across the surface like water over stones. It was less a room and more a cockpit, an organic one. The patterns weren't decorative. They were interfaces, controls. You could see the logic in them now, the way certain clusters of light corresponded to systems, the way the flow of information changed speed and direction. Kurzeth didn't offer a grand speech. She just walked to the center of the room and held up her arm. Her own irregular patterns, the ones the court called a defect, began to shift and realign. They didn't just glow. They communicated. Specific sequences of light flowed from her skin to the wall, a silent conversation in a language of photons. A section of the wall responded, its patterns shifting to mirror hers, then displaying a complex schematic of what looked like a planetary grid. "The defect is the access code," she said, her voice flat without pride or bitterness. It was a statement of fact. "They are keeper authentication sequences. My bloodline was the original security protocol for these systems." The story of her flawed genetics was a cover, a convenient lie. It was easier to dismiss her as broken than to admit she held keys to locks they couldn't pick. She gestured to the schematic. It wasn't a weapon. It was a network, a planetary defense system, but not in the way the military used the term. This wasn't about projecting power. It was about protection. It could raise shields over civilian population centers, create atmospheric buffers against orbital bombardment. It was a defensive umbrella, designed to make war too costly, too pointless to wage on a populated world. Another gesture. The schematic changed. This one showed a web of transit routes, evacuation corridors that could be activated across the empire. Refugee evacuation networks. They required keeper authorization. Without her biometric approval, the routes remained dormant, lines on a map that led nowhere. People stayed trapped in conflict zones because the system to get them out was locked behind a genetic key they'd tried to erase. She called up another protocol, emergency shelter construction. The schematic showed automated systems that could deploy from subterranean vaults, building habitable structures in hours, not months. They were designed for crisis response, for natural disasters or the aftermath of attacks. They lay dormant, unused because the command to initiate required a keeper's living signature. The current power structure had no interest in activating them. Crises were more profitable than solutions. Resource distribution. The display showed supply lines, rationing protocols, emergency allocation systems for food, water, medicine. All of it required her approval to move beyond a trickle. Her biometric signature was the valve. Without it, aid could be slowed, diverted, or stopped entirely. It gave someone immense power to decide who suffered and who prospered during a disaster. The current power structure, the one with chancellors and generals, profited from keeping all of this offline. A functioning, automated humanitarian network would have made their political games irrelevant. You can't leverage a famine for concessions if a system exists to just end the famine. You can't profit from rebuilding contracts if shelters build themselves. You can't control populations through fear and scarcity if the tools to create abundance and safety are just sitting there, waiting for the right person to log in. Her existence wasn't a defect. It was a threat to a very profitable status quo. They hadn't hidden her away because she was broken. They'd hidden her because she worked too well. Kurzeth's voice was calm, the tone of someone explaining a simple, ugly truth. She wasn't angry. She was stating a market analysis. Peace is expensive to maintain, but not very profitable, she said, watching the data flow across the walls of her chamber. The lights traced supply lines, budget allocations, contract values. Controlled warfare, on the other hand, generates reliable, predictable revenue streams for specific sectors of the economy. It is a business model. She didn't need to name the sectors. The evidence was right there in the glowing schematics. Weapons manufacturers were the obvious beneficiaries. Their stock valuations spiked with every new border skirmish, every official statement about rising tensions. Their lobbying arms wrote, the legislation that ensured military budgets only ever grew. But they weren't alone. Logistics corporations made fortunes moving troops and materiel. Their fees for emergency transport during a crisis were 10 times the standard rate. Mercenary groups flourished, offering security services to planets that couldn't afford a standing army. Their contracts renewed with every new threat. The dark irony was the humanitarian side. Even the aid agencies, the refugee relief organizations, depended on the funding that only flowed during a disaster. Their donations dried up during peacetime. Their budgets were approved by governments looking to manage a crisis, not prevent one. They became part of the machine. Their good intentions funneled through an economy that needed there to be victims in order to function. Refugees themselves were not just people in those equations. They were assets and liabilities. A stream of displaced civilians could be used as a bargaining chip in negotiations, proof of an opponent's brutality or a reason to demand more concessions. Their suffering was a political tool. Their numbers were a statistic in a report arguing for more funding, more weapons, more control. Then she gestured to her own systems, the dormant networks waiting for her command. These protocols make large-scale civilian casualties a logistical impossibility, she explained. The planetary defense shields could protect cities. The evacuation corridors could empty conflict zones in hours. The emergency shelters could house millions. They removed the civilian element from the warfare equation. And that was the real threat. That was the reason for the redacted files, the court whispers, the manufactured story of her defect. If you can't threaten populations, if you can't create refugees, if you can't generate the humanitarian crises that justify the spending, then the entire war economy collapses. The profits from fear evaporate. The political leverage gained by controlling secure resources during a disaster vanishes. Billions in contracts, Entire corporate empires built on supplying conflict. Political careers founded on being the strong leader during a crisis. All of it became obsolete if her systems came online. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. The power to decide when and where people suffered. The power to use that suffering for gain. The opposition from Chancellor Thexmer and General Hawkins snapped into a new, brutal focus. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even purely political. It was economic. Thexmer's faction likely had deep ties to the corporations that built the ships and the guns. Hawkins and his officers were the consumers of those products, their prestige and power tied to the budget allocated to them. They weren't just opposing a diplomatic choice. They were defending their revenue model. Thomas's selection of Kurzeth wasn't an insult to their traditions. It was a threat to their bottom line. Their outrage in the throne room wasn't about protocol. It was about a hostile takeover of their most profitable industry. The chamber hummed. Not the low drone of machinery, but a deeper sound, like the inside of a beehive felt through your bones. The light on the walls pulsed in slow, complex waves, and the air felt heavy, charged. Thomas and Kurzeth stood at the center of the room. There was no audience for this part. No cameras. This was a different kind of ceremony. The bonding wasn't a matter of words or signatures. It needed two active keys, his and hers. His came from the diplomatic authorization codes embedded in his official profile, a complex cipher that verified he acted for Earth's collective interests. Hers was in her biology, the shifting light patterns on her skin that were the last active keys to the keeper systems. It required both, a human's intent and a keeper's blood. One without the other was useless. He had to consent. His official profile had to align with the system's parameters. The system scanned his diplomatic record, his voting history on aid proposals, his authored treaties. It wasn't looking for loyalty to a flag. It was looking for a pattern of humanitarian priority. It was checking his work. Her own light patterns, intensified, flowing from her body to the walls in a rapid, intricate dance. The light from the walls flowed back. It was a conversation between her genetic code and the room's ancient operating system. They were authenticating each other. The systems, dormant for generations, recognized her. She was the real thing. His codes went in. Her patterns responded. The two separate authorization streams met in the center of the room, a point of light in the air between them. They didn't merge so much as they intertwined, weaving together into a new hybrid signal. It was like two different types of encryption creating a third, more complex key that neither could make alone. The result wasn't a merger of governments. It was the creation of a new command layer, a separate authority that sat above both Earth's diplomatic core and the Luminary Empire's power structure. It was a joint custody of the galactic emergency systems. No single president, no queen, no general could give an order to these networks alone anymore. It required a consensus between a specific human diplomat and the last keeper. Their union was a lock that needed two very different keys to open. This wasn't a marriage. There were no rings, no vows of affection. It was a technological and strategic handshake, a binding agreement written in light and data. They weren't becoming partners in a romantic sense. They were becoming co-administrators, the custodians of a vast sleeping infrastructure built to save lives, not take them. Their job was to wake it up. The hum in the room shifted, deepening from a standby frequency to an active operational thrum. Schematics across the walls, which had been static diagrams, suddenly glowed with a steady, ready light. Status reports began to scroll, showing systems coming online, networks pinging across the galaxy, checking in after a long silence. The evacuation corridors, the planetary shields, the emergency shelter fabricators, they were no longer theoretical. They were live. They were waiting for the first command from the new management. The room felt less like a chamber and more like a bridge. Their bridge. And the galaxy, with all its simmering conflicts and hidden suffering, was suddenly a map they could actually do something about.